If you ain't first, you're last. Does that ring a bell with anyone? Has anyone seen the movie Talladega Nights, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby? It's kind of, a bit of an irreverent and silly movie. There is a character, the main character of the movie, his name is Ricky Bobby, and he grows up believing just that. It's his personal credo. If you ain't first, you're last. You've got to be the greatest. Well, Ricky Bobby grows up and he becomes a NASCAR driver. In fact, one that turns out to be highly successful. And he believes that this greatness is because of that slogan and the way that he's driven and because of his own gifts and skills as a driver. But as in life, adversity sometimes pops up, and it does for Ricky Bobby. He gets into a crash and eventually is consumed by fear and struggles to drive again. He hits a low and he actually loses his ride. Last week, Pastor talked about fear. He used the example of the baseball team and a player who at one point in time was so exuberant he was willing to go anywhere and play the whole field, even though his responsibility was just for a certain portion. But after a time, you could see where he had developed some fear about playing and catching, and eventually he too fell by the wayside and fell away from it. That type of fear is devastating, and that is the type of fear that Ricky Bobby experienced here, even though his job was just to play his part. Well, Ricky Bobby's estranged father, Reese Bobby, shows up on the scene, and he tries to help Ricky Bobby get his mojo back and to be competitive again. And he tells him, look, you've got to learn to drive with the fear. There ain't nothing more frightening than driving with a live cougar in the car. And so that's what his father actually does. Ricky Bobby goes to open the door and there is a cougar inside the car. And he tells him, you have to do this to overcome the fear of driving. Reese then reveals to Ricky one more thing about Ricky Bobby's credo. If you ain't first, you're last, because he says it. And Reese Bobby, his father, looks at Ricky Bobby and he says, well, that's ridiculous. You could be second, you could be third, you could be fourth. That doesn't make any sense. And Ricky Bobby looks at him and he says, but that's what you told me when I was a child. Of course, his father blamed it on maybe his excessive drinking, or he may have been a little high when he said it. But so a lot of things come crashing down for Ricky. There may be plenty of us that have a little bit of that old Ricky Bobby in us. Fortunately for Ricky, he goes on to understand things differently after those couple of hard lessons about managing fear, and that it's not all about being the greatest. And we might have a little bit of that in ourselves. Society reinforces it. It's no different for us today, where we're told we need to be the greatest. It was no different in the disciples' day either. It's hard to resist the belief that with our own wisdom and abilities that we can achieve greatness of our own accord. That is what makes Jesus' message so countercultural and so radical, both then and now, when he says, anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and be the servant of all. Last week, the disciples had heard for the first time Jesus foretell of his death. And in the gospel reading today, it's the second time that Jesus foretells them about his death. The disciples didn't understand it fully, and they avoided the conversation with Jesus. For sure, they didn't want to see what Jesus was saying come true. Perhaps away from Jesus, they talked about how they would continue without him if it were to happen, and who would lead. Perhaps they each could see themselves leading after he was gone. It's not unusual for an organization to be concerned about going forward when experiencing the loss. So it's not unreasonable, and we shouldn't be too harsh on the disciples for considering this. But whatever it was, we don't know, they begin to talk about greatness. They seem temporarily blinded to what those aspirations to be great, especially in that society at that time, meant, and what the values and perceptions that came with it were. And they may have lost sight of the fact that it's those values that were keeping over 90% of the population at that time as peasants. And at the root of it, that's not really what they were after. But sometimes that's what comes from striving for what the world tells us. So their conversation is exactly the opposite of what Jesus has been trying to teach them. Of course, Jesus knows what it was about, but he asked them what they were arguing about, and they were ashamed or embarrassed to tell him. I'm sure we've all found ourselves in that type of a position at one time or another. So Jesus sets about to correct their conversation, which had revealed both the disciples' fear and their misunderstanding of what it was to be great. This fear and misunderstanding that's rooted in the false wisdom that James was talking about in the second reading today is false wisdom. James claims it comes from jealousy and selfish ambition. This false or earthly wisdom talks incessantly, but true wisdom listens. False wisdom blathers on about faith, but true wisdom goes quietly about faithful acts. False wisdom is about our abilities, losing sight of the fact that our abilities are God-given. Relying on our own wisdom instead of relying and trusting in God's. Further, James says you do not have because you do not ask God. Asking in this instance refers to prayer. The most effective way to stay out of the world and earthly wisdom and stay aligned with God's wisdom and his purposes for the use of our God-given gifts is through prayer. In prayer, we're equipped to be wise. And this wisdom happens when we put the things of God first. It happens when we learn to live lives of peace. It happens when we love our neighbors. It happens when we learn to focus on the needs of others. Yes, the disciples may have been caught up or blinded by that earthly wisdom, just like Ricky Bobby. And in usual Jesus form, he doesn't condemn them, doesn't even give them a hard time. Instead, Jesus calls a timeout. We're in the football season now, and to me, this is the equivalent of Jesus calling a timeout. He gathers the 12 to him, he sits down, which seems to frequently happen when Jesus is about to reveal to them something really important, the really good stuff. And in this case, Jesus needed to help fix that misperception. So he gathers them. He calls that time out. And in essence says to them, look, you want to be the greatest? Here's how. Anyone who wants to be first must be last. And on top of that, they must be the servant of all. In Ricky Bobby's terms, Jesus tells them, if you ain't last, you can't be first. To illustrate his point, Jesus takes a little child in his arms, and he said to the disciples, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me doesn't welcome me, but the one who sent me. It's an important illustration. In the first century, children were of the lowest social status and completely without power in both the Gentile and the Jewish cultures. They had no legal rights and had no societal protection or cares except for what the parents could provide. So Jesus defines for them all as those of the lowest social status without any protection or care. Further, he says it's through serving them that we welcome God. Not just do they see the face of God in our actions, but we welcome God. And God blesses us every much as they are blessed when we reach out to help those that are in the margin. A couple months ago, I put an article in The Voice encouraging us to pray about how God has gifted us and about his purpose for us with those gifts that he has so graciously provided. It's clear, every single one of us, God has a purpose for. We're all uniquely created. We all have unique experiences, and God has blessed us with abilities to make a difference in this world. So there is a next step. That next step is to consider how we respond to Jesus' call today in the gospel. Not to be first, but to be last and to be a servant. Well, next week, we have the opportunity to respond as part of our Mission Sunday. Similar to the way that we make a commitment of our financial resources and our treasure, next Sunday we will make a same type of a commitment with regard to our time and our talent, in an opportunity to apply those gifts. If we could, Donna, and if we could get a couple of individuals to help her hand out a booklet. So this booklet that they're distributing, and for those of you that are listening to this pre-recorded, there is a booklet called Moving Mission Forward. And in it there is an information card. That will be available online at the St. John website. So if you're not here today and you're listening to this and have the opportunity, you'll find these resources on St. John's website. So this booklet is a reminder of the many ways that the people and the friends of St. John can find activities or groups or ministries to plug into, ways to grow and exercise those God-given gifts. Many of these groups or activities support our common mission and look after the activities of the church so that we can be effective together as God's people. Some of them are to provide ministry opportunity, serving in worship and serving each other here, as well as the important steps of serving and reaching out into our community to find those individuals that are in need, where we have ability and gifts to help. Inside, there is a card. This card can be used to seek information about a ministry that you may be interested in. If you look through the booklet and find something that you feel, after praying about it, that God may be calling you to learn more about, you can request information. The contact names are actually in the booklet, and if you were so moved, you could get a hold of that person directly. But you can also have the opportunity to fill out this card and check the box next to a ministry that you're interested in and you think God may be calling you in a new way to exercise those gifts. For some, it may just be an affirmation of ministries that you're already involved in. So many of you are already such a blessing to St. John and to our community because you utilize those gifts in these ministries on a particular way. So for you, it may be just an affirmation, but it may also be an opportunity to find something new, maybe some new way God's calling you to serve and use those gifts he's given you. So I'll encourage you to pray for guidance, read the booklet to find an opportunity where your gifts fit and that will be a blessing to you and others. Fill out the card, bring it to worship next week, or if you're not going to be here, you can certainly drop it off at the office, or if you're online and unable to get to the office, you can mail it in. And it will be offered at the altar as part of our worship next week. There's no better way to make a commitment than to present it before God and give back to him that which he has already given us. Last week, Pastor observed that after 2,000 years of Jesus' wisdom, We still have such a long way to go as a society to achieve the wisdom that Jesus provided us. And he encouraged us, and the readings from last week encourage us to pick up our cross. Pastor encouraged us to manage our field in playing in that part of the field in which God has called us to. And ask, what must I do? What's my part? Next week, we'll have the opportunity to extend that. We'll have the opportunity to respond to Jesus' call for us to be a servant of all. But make no mistake, no one could do all of these things. When Jesus says all, it was simply the definition of those who are in need of and support and love that we can provide through the gifts that God has granted us. So no one can do all of these things. But I'll leave you with one last thought. No one can do everything, but everyone can do something. Amen.